16 months after a crash that nearly ended his life, Ben Hogan arrived at Marion Golf Club in June of 1950 with his legs heavily bandaged. His comeback at the 50th United States Open Championship would become one of the most famous moments in golf history. Yet beneath Hogan's golf shoes was a tiny equipment modification that was almost invisible to spectators walking alongside the fairways. His shoes used a non-standard arrangement of metal spikes with extra cleats added for additional traction. One of those unusual spikes can even be seen on the sole of Hogan's raised right shoe in the famous photograph taken at Marion. In a sport where tiny equipment details can matter, Hogan was already known as one of golf's great perfectionists, a player who examined his clubs, his grip, his ball flight, and his swing with extraordinary attention. And that strange detail underneath his shoes raises a fascinating question. Why did one of the greatest ball strikers in history feel that the standard spike pattern on a golf shoe was not enough? Because Hogan's footwear became part of the imagery surrounding his extraordinary 1950 comeback, it is tempting to assume the extra spikes were created specifically because of his injuries. But the surviving evidence does not establish that, and the fact that Hogan continued using unusually spiked shoes many years later makes the story even more interesting. To understand the context surrounding Hogan's appearance at Marion, we first have to go back 16 months. On February 2nd, 1949, Ben Hogan and his wife, Valerie, were traveling through West Texas when their car collided head-on with a Greyhound bus in dense fog. Just before impact, Hogan threw himself across the front seat toward Valerie. The movement likely saved his life. The steering column was driven into the area where Hogan had been sitting only moments before, but the collision still left him with devastating injuries. Hogan suffered a fractured pelvis, a fractured left ankle, a fractured collarbone, and other serious injuries. Then, while recovering in hospital, his condition became even more dangerous. Blood clots developed in his legs. Doctors performed emergency surgery involving the inferior vena cava in an attempt to prevent additional clots from reaching his heart and lungs. The operation saved Hogan, but his circulatory system would never completely return to normal. For the rest of his playing career, extended periods of standing and walking could produce severe swelling, fatigue, and pain in his legs. At first, there were serious doubts that Hogan would ever return to championship golf. Yet by early 1950, he was competing again, and when he arrived at Marion for the United States Open, his legs were wrapped tightly in elastic bandages to help control the swelling. His comeback was already extraordinary before he struck a single shot, but Hogan's shoes contained another interesting detail. Golf shoes of that era typically used metal spikes attached beneath relatively traditional leather uppers. Hogan's footwear, however, used a non-standard arrangement with additional cleats. Historical accounts specifically describe Hogan adding extra spikes for traction. Exactly when he first began doing this is much less clear. There is no reliable documentation proving that Hogan introduced the modification only after his 1949 crash. There is also no reason to assume it was simply compensation for a damaged right ankle. The ankle Hogan fractured in the accident was his left. What the surviving evidence does show is that extra spiked footwear remained part of Hogan's equipment long after Marion, so the modification appears to have been much more than a temporary solution for one tournament. To understand why additional traction might interest a golfer like Hogan, it helps to look at what the feet actually do during the swing. The golf swing creates substantial forces between the player and the ground. Pressure shifts during the backswing and downswing. The lower body rotates. The golfer uses the ground to maintain balance while accelerating the club through the ball. Hogan's swing made extensive use of lower body rotation and pressure transfer, but this does not mean his feet remained locked to the ground. They did not. Film and photographs clearly show Hogan's right heel rising as he rotated through impact and into the follow-through. The purpose of additional spikes was therefore not to bolt Hogan's foot permanently into the turf. They were used to provide additional traction while still allowing the foot to move naturally through the swing. Beyond that, we have to be careful. Hogan's exact explanation for the precise placement of the extra cleats is not well documented. There is no surviving pressure map showing that he calculated a specific mechanical pivot point. There there is no reliable evidence that the extra spikes were designed to cure his famous hook, and there is no proof that one extra cleat somehow compensated for his post-accident injuries. What is documented is simpler. Hogan deliberately modified his golf shoes to give himself more traction, and that fits perfectly with what we know about his approach to equipment. The extra spikes were not an isolated eccentricity. Hogan became famous for obsessing over small variables. Golf Digest has reported that he altered the insert in one of his fairway woods with an additional screw because he believed it changed the club's performance. He was also known to test golf balls for imperfections, including floating them in salt water to identify balls he believed were not perfectly balanced. Accounts also describe him closely inspecting the surfaces and dimples of golf balls for manufacturing inconsistencies. Whether every one of Hogan's theories would survive modern laboratory testing is almost beside the point. What matters is the mindset. Hogan did not like leaving variables to chance. If he believed a club, a ball, or even the bottom of a shoe could be improved, he was willing to experiment. The additional spikes fit directly into that pattern, and in June 1950, Hogan arrived at Marion wearing those shoes while attempting something many people had once believed impossible. The United States Open format at the time required players to complete 72 holes over only 3 days. 18 holes were played Thursday, another 18 on Friday, then on Saturday, the surviving players faced 36 holes in a single day. For a healthy golfer, that was exhausting. For Hogan, whose legs could swell painfully after prolonged periods on his feet, it was an enormous physical test. He opened the championship on Thursday, June 8th, with a 2 over par 72. It was a respectable score, but it did not place him near the lead. Lee Mackey shocked the field with an opening 64. Hogan finished the day tied for 18th, 8 strokes behind. On Friday, everything changed. Hogan produced a 1 under par 69. His total of 141 moved him into 5th place. He was now only 2 strokes behind 36-hole leader Dutch Harrison. The tournament that had begun with Hogan far down the leaderboard was suddenly within reach. Then came Saturday, 36 holes. In the morning 3rd round, Hogan fought through mounting fatigue and posted a 2 over par 72. That left him close enough to contend during the final 18 holes that afternoon. By then, however, the physical toll was becoming obvious. Hogan had already walked 54 championship holes in 3 days. His damaged circulatory system made every additional mile increasingly painful. His legs were bandaged. They swelled. Between shots, his movement became slower and more difficult. Yet Hogan continued, and late on Saturday afternoon, he arrived at Marion's 18th hole, needing par to join Lloyd Mangrum and George Fazio in a playoff. The final hole at Marion was one of the most demanding finishing holes in championship golf. Hogan drove into the fairway. He was then left with a long approach to the elevated green. He selected the club that would become one of the most famous irons in golf history, his 1-iron. Hogan struck the ball onto the green. It finished roughly 40 feet from the hole. The photograph taken moments after impact became one of the defining images of American golf. Hogan's body is perfectly balanced through the finish. His right heel is raised, and on the sole of the shoe, visible to the camera, the unusual spike arrangement can be seen. Hogan then 2-putted for par. His final round 74 completed a 72-hole total of 287. He was tied with Mangrum and Fazio after playing 72 holes over 3 physically brutal days. Hogan now had to return on Sunday morning and do it again. The playoff would bring his total for the championship to 90 holes. On June 11th, Hogan returned to Marion. He shot a 1 under par 69. Mangrum shot 73. Fazio shot 75. Hogan won by 4 strokes. 16 months after doctors had questioned whether he would return to competitive golf at all, Ben Hogan was the United States Open champion. It remains one of the most famous comeback victories in sports history, but it is important not to exaggerate the role of his shoes. Hogan wore extra spiked footwear during his comeback. That is documented. The extra cleats were intended to provide additional traction. That is also documented. What we cannot say is that a spike won the championship. We cannot assign his 69 on Friday to his shoes. We cannot say his famous 1-iron reached the green because of one particular cleat. And we cannot prove that the footwear modification was created specifically because of the 1949 crash. Hogan won because he remained an extraordinary golfer. His swing mechanics, ball striking, course management, mental discipline, and ability to endure enormous physical discomfort were the primary reasons reasons he survived 90 holes at Merion. The shoes were simply one small piece of equipment used by a man famous for paying attention to very small pieces. And that brings us to the most interesting part of the story. The unusual spikes did not disappear after Hogan recovered from the immediate aftermath of the accident. They remained part of his equipment. Decades later, accounts of Hogan at the 1967 Masters still specifically mention his shoes containing additional spikes. That was almost 18 years after the crash. By then, there could be little argument that Hogan was merely wearing a temporary medical modification for his 1950 comeback. The continued use strongly suggests that the additional traction had become a lasting equipment preference. Exactly what Hogan felt beneath his feet is difficult to reconstruct today. Perhaps the modification made him feel more secure during rotation. Perhaps it gave him more confidence on wet or uneven turf. Perhaps the advantage was partly physical and partly psychological. Hogan did not leave us a detailed engineering explanation, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the modification so fascinating. This was not a commercially marketed technology. It was not accompanied by advertisements explaining its benefits. There was no scientific paper describing its placement. It was simply something one of golf's most meticulous players believed was worth keeping underneath his feet. Modern golf shoes approach traction in a very different way. Manufacturers can now use pressure mapping, force plates, computer modeling, and laboratory testing to study how players interact with the ground. The locations and shapes of traction elements can be engineered according to the forces produced during the swing. Metal spikes themselves have largely disappeared from recreational golf, replaced by softer, removable cleats and increasingly sophisticated spikeless patterns. There is no evidence that Hogan's modification directly caused that evolution. He did not single-handedly create modern golf footwear, but his extra spikes remain an unusually early example of an elite golfer modifying footwear specifically because traction mattered to him. And in that sense, the story says something larger about Ben Hogan. Most golfers looked down and saw a pair of golf shoes. Hogan apparently saw another variable, something that could be adjusted, something that could potentially be improved. The same mentality appeared in his clubs, in his golf balls, in his practice, and even underneath his feet. That is the real secret behind Ben Hogan's extra spikes. Not that one piece of metal magically allowed an injured golfer to win the United States Open, but that one of the most obsessive perfectionists in golf history considered even the arrangement of the spikes beneath his shoes important enough to modify. And years after his famous victory at Merion, he was still doing it. Whatever precise advantage Ben Hogan believed those extra spikes gave him, he apparently valued it enough to keep them for decades. What do you think about Hogan's unusual equipment preference? Would one extra piece of traction beneath your shoe make any difference to your swing, or was the real advantage simply knowing that every possible detail had been considered? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to Smarter Fairway for more deep dives into the hidden equipment choices, technical innovations, and forgotten stories that shaped golf. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.